Professor Ward has held lectureships in logic at Glasgow, in philosophy at St Andrews, in philosophy of religion at King's College London. He was fellow, dean, and director of studies here in Cambridge at Trinity Hall before taking up a professorship at the University of London. Professor Ward is an ordained priest in the Church of England, a fellow of the British Academy, and a member of the governing council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And he held the Regius Professorship of Divinity at Oxford before becoming Gresham Professor of Divinity between 2004 and 2008. He's the author of many popular and academic books, including influential studies of Kant's development of ethics, divine action, religious pluralism, and more recently he's produced an excellent critique of materialism in More Than Matter, a critique of biblical literalism in The Word of God, the Bible After Modern Scholarship, and more recently a philosophical analysis of the teachings of Jesus in The Philosopher and the Gospels.
Thank you. Well, my worldview in 20 minutes. I'll start by saying that the world of philosophy, of course, is a world of disagreement. And it's quite wrong to think that reasonable people will all agree about anything at all. And the more reasonable you are, the more you will disagree with everybody else. And I say that as a result of a lifetime of trying to talk to philosophers. And so we're not looking at agreement in the world of philosophy. We're looking for trying to get a coherent and adequate and fruitful view of the world from the place where you start from and how you need to adjust that in the light of new knowledge that you come across. So where do I start from? Well, I'm an idealist, a personal idealist, but you may not know what that is. So let me just give a slight characterization of it. Many philosophers don't have a worldview. They don't think in such grand terms. You wouldn't necessarily have to have a whole grand narrative of the world to be a philosopher. You don't have to at all. But nevertheless, there are some very deep disputes in philosophy, and one of the deepest is the dispute between materialism and idealism. And it's these two extremes and slight stereotypes put in that form which I'm concerned with. And materialism would, I'll start with a rather crude definition, with the view that everything that exists is material. There is nothing that exists that is not material. So God, if God is not material, doesn't exist, probably couldn't exist. And it may be a necessary truth that everything that exists has to exist in some material form. Now, that's a crude definition, but you can see the point. The point would be that mind and thought and consciousness and things associated with that would be at best emergent features of matter, but they might actually be reducible to material things, so that mental states would be reducible to brain states. So a very hardline reductionist in materialism would say there aren't any personal experiences, there aren't any thoughts. My own teacher here at Oxford, Gilbert Ryle, used to say there are no mental images. I used to sit there having mental images in front of him. And he said, you can't be because there aren't any. And, well, that's a philosophical debate of one sort. But for a materialist, you would say there could be no mental thoughts in the sense that the accurate way to describe them is some firing of neurons in the brain, and that's the most accurate way. That's a very hard line. I think probably most materialists would be people who say, well, there may be mental thoughts and experiences and feelings, but they depend upon and they are caused by material brain states, and so they don't have any independent causal efficacy of their own. So that's materialism. But the big opposite metaphysical camp to this is idealism. And idealists think the opposite. They turn the whole thing upside down and say, actually, matter is a product of mind, that mind is the true reality, that the thing we are most clearly and firstly aware of is our own consciousness and its contents. And it's only as we grow from being little babies that we begin to say that there are objects apart from us in a physical world, and that there are other people and other minds with whom we converse. But little babies perhaps start in a world where these conceptual distinctions are not made, but there are experiences. Babies do have experiences, and I think before they have thoughts. But that's another philosophically disputable topic. So an idealist would say, well, in some sense, the mind is the thing you start from, and you can't get away from it. Now, I was brought up in my philosophical training to be an empiricist, and an empiricist is a person who says, we all start in our knowing from experience. That's where you start. All knowledge begins with experience. Now, I still believe that. And I therefore incline to think that experience cannot be eliminated. So I could never be a reductionist materialist. I could never say there aren't any experiences. They used to be called sense data in the old days. Sounds and sights and colors and feelings and thoughts. All of the contents of your consciousness, which perhaps other people never know about in the same way that you know about them. I think they are features of reality. They are features of the world. Consciousness is often thought of or described as the hard problem in physics. But actually, for an idealist philosopher like me, it's not a hard problem at all, because consciousness is what you are most immediately aware of. The problem is there anything else? And that's the problem of David Hume's problem, how you can say that there is actually an objective world at all. Now, that may sound a bit strange, that philosophy does very often, but you're not really querying the existence of an objective world. You're saying, is the world as it exists objectively the same as it is when it appears to me in my consciousness? Is my consciousness of the world different from the world as it really is? And here again, I would think, well, modern physics appears to say it's very, very different, and the objective reality might consist of an 11-dimensional reality of wave functions, and not at all consist of solid-colored, three-dimensional objects. So the way it might be to a quantum physicist would be very different from the way it appears to me in the common-sense world. And that gives rise to a real problem. All quantum physicists, if they think about philosophy, have this problem, which is reality. Is it the wave functions in some multidimensional space, or is it the world of common sense? And you can go either way on this. Philosophy consists of always making these decisions about which way you're going to go. And I would just say that as a philosopher, my decision would be to go with the reality of consciousness and say, well, actually, consciousness is real. I'm not sure whether 11-dimensional realities are real, but at least talk of that sort of thing makes me certain that the way I am conscious of the world, that is, the world as it appears to my consciousness, is very different from the world as it is when I'm not being conscious of it. Now, this doesn't get you right to idealism, but it gets you to saying, perhaps, that consciousness is a real factor of the world. It cannot be eliminated. And then you ask the question, well, what's the relation between consciousness and the physical world? There is a physical world. I'm not doubting that for a moment. But it's very different from anything we see or hear or touch. It's more of a conceptual construction. We hope it's an actual one, but it's very different from anything that intuition or your feelings might tell you that the world was like. So at this stage, then, I'm clear that consciousness is very important, that it's real, it's irreducible to material things, so there is more than matter in the universe. That's the first stage of where I go as an idealist. But then you have to ask the question, as you go more deeply into it, well, if there is consciousness, is there such a thing as a continuing self of consciousness? That is there an agent, a subject of consciousness, one being who is conscious of many different things at the same time, sights and sounds and thoughts and feelings, and who is conscious of a chain of experiences continuing through time, and who actually acts as an agent throughout those experiences, being the same agent, changing in character, but being the same agent throughout a continuous stretch of time. Again, a big philosophical question. And I'm not arguing that you have to believe one of these things. I'm just saying this is how it seems to me that the most reasonable way to take it is that there is such a thing as a continuing subject-agent self. Now, at that point, many empiricists diverge from me. So Freddie Eyre, for example, would say, yes, there is certainly sense data, there's certainly consciousness, but there's no self. There's nothing which has experiences. Philosophers who might agree with me, there is a continuing self, would be Peter Strawson, who was here at Oxford, and would say, no, you can't think of just a chain of experience without anything which connects them, which is not in some sense continuous. So all I'm saying is here's another big problem. I think the world is full of problems. I'm not certain about anything. Don't get me wrong. I'm a priest of the Church of England, and I'm not certain of anything. Okay? There's nothing I'm certain of. Everything is problematic as far as I'm concerned, but I've got to make some decisions. I can't just sit around and say, oh, it's all such a terrible problem, I can't make a decision. So I try to make my decisions, and I say, right, consciousness is important. And I think that the mind is something which you could intelligibly speak of as a continuing agent self. So I've not only got feelings and thoughts, etc., I have an agent. And I don't want to jump into Descartes here, but I'll just say Descartes is very much misunderstood in my view, but that he was quite right in thinking that if you have a continuing consciousness and agency, then you're talking in some sense about a substantial self. That is what, of course, theologians call the soul, or used to call the soul, that continuing self, the subject of experience. Well, keep pressing these sorts of questions and ask this philosophical question. All right, there could be, it's an intelligible supposition that there is a continuing subject and agent of human conscious experiences, but could this subject, could these experiences exist without the material embodiment? Nobody's going to disagree that experiences are materially embodied. Even Descartes said quite clearly that there are not, mind and matter are not just two separate things. They are, he said, indivisibly intertwined so as to form one thing. He made quite a clear statement about that. So you're talking about one thing which is both material and, well, the word is really spiritual. It's not material. It has the attributes of consciousness, thought, feeling, and intention, and we call that the spiritual. So how does the material relate to the spiritual, and are they separable? Well, at this point, again, I would just advert to David Hume, who is a very great philosopher, if wrong about most things, and David Hume said, well, anything that you can conceive apart, that you can imagine apart, could logically exist apart. Whether it does or not, we don't know, but it could. So at this point, I'll bring Hume to my aid and say, I think you can conceive mental activities existing without there being a physical brain at all. I can imagine it quite easily. And in fact, people didn't know that the brain was the seat of conscious experiences and thoughts until fairly recently in human history. Aristotle thought the brain was a sort of air conditioning unit. So, it's a scientific discovery that the brain is the place where thoughts take place. And I'd want to say, well, yes, all right, there's certainly a very close connection there, but couldn't thoughts and experiences happen without a physical brain? And here I'd say, well, I don't know whether they do, but they certainly could. I'm in no doubt of that. I can stand here and I can imagine that I'd be a bit worried. My arm disappeared, and then my body disappeared, and then eventually my head disappeared. I disappeared completely, but I'd go on talking. Words emanate from me. I see you sitting there. Now, you may say, that's very strange, but it's possible. It's logically possible. It's not self-contradictory. And so I do think that minds could exist without physical embodiment. Of course, people who believe in God, you've been waiting for me to say that word, I suppose, people who believe in God think there's at least one mind which is not physically embodied. And I think that's quite conceivable. There may be lots of minds which are not physically embodied. That's a possibility. Well, you want to go a bit further than this and say, well, what difference might that make to the world? Well, the main thing I want to say at this point is that some people who shall be nameless talk about religious belief as though it were belief in something like a flying spaghetti monster, something utterly stupid that nobody's ever really seriously thought about, but for which there's no evidence, and say that's what religious belief is. Well, I simply want to point out that that is a total travesty of the truth, that belief in a mind which is not embodied, which acts to control things that happen in the world, is a totally natural belief. It's not like believing in a spaghetti monster. It's believing that you, as a conscious being who act in the world and who perceive things, could possibly do that while not being embodied, and therefore there could be such a being. It's a logical possibility. And that's a very natural way to think. I believe most humans probably start when they're very young of thinking of the world like that, as a world as a place where intentional causality operates. Now, of course, we know that we cannot now understand the universe as an area where intentional causality operates. And I want to make a distinction, if I can, between two sorts of important explanation, nomological and axiological. Nomological explanation is scientific explanation. It refers to laws. You say, here's a law which says if A, then B. It describes what happens, but it makes no reference to the future. It just says this is a law. You need the initial conditions in the law, then you can perhaps predict. But axiological explanation is explanation in terms of reasons for the sake of which you will do an action. So I give you an axiological explanation of why I am here tonight by saying I thought about it and decided I would like to come. It was something I wanted to do in order to say what my worldview was. Let's just say that's what I thought. So I was doing some action, I was doing something in order to bring about some effect which I thought to be good. Now that's axiological explanation. And I want to say this, I've got to say it quickly, of course, but that axiological explanation is not reducible to nomological explanation. It's a different sort of explanation. So you have many sorts of explanation of the universe, but one of them, which we apply to humans mostly and sometimes to animals, is that you say certainly some things happen because some mind conceives of something and brings about a state of affairs in order that there should be something that they consider to be good to exist. And that gives you the idea, well, could there be a being which did this to the universe? Because we don't do it to the whole universe, only our bit of the universe. So the idea of God is a very natural idea. And that's all I'm wanting to say. It's not a stupid idea. It's not an irrational idea. It naturally arises from consideration of consciousness and the fact that the best thing known to us is our own conscious experience and our own intentional agency. And it's very difficult, I think, to give a complete explanation of this in purely physical terms. I know very good philosophers are trying to do it. I do not myself believe that any of them has succeeded. And I doubt whether they really believe they've succeeded. They're making good efforts. I applaud the efforts, but I can't see any chance of success. So there I am. I'm an idealist. I believe that mind is more certainly known to us than matter. I'm not even sure what matter is, but I won't go into that. And I think that intentional causality is more fundamental than simply causal law causality, where you say the laws exist, but I don't know why. There's no reason for that. But how do I get from there to religion or to God? Well, since I've now got about 4 minutes left, I'll just say you can be an idealist without believing in God. Idealists include Immanuel Kant, Aristotle, Bradley, a very famous philosopher in the beginning of the 20th century in Britain, and almost every philosopher who occurs on history of ideas syllabuses in universities. They have almost all been idealists. And Kant put this very clearly: the world as it appears to us is a world which is a function of our minds, mind-constructed. The world as it is in itself is totally unknown to us, but it is in fact, he thought, an intelligible reality. Okay? It's something not material. It is a spiritual reality. But you don't have to call that God. So how do you get to God? And I have to do this again very quickly, but it goes like this. If you become an idealist or somebody sympathetic to thinking, could it be that mind is the most fundamental reality in the universe and that somehow the whole universe exists for the sake of realizing some good and that that's how it came about? If that's a possibility, if that were true, wouldn't it be almost overwhelmingly obvious that this being would reveal something of what its purpose and its nature was? So you'd begin perhaps to look for instances of revelation or where there's been a claim that somebody has managed to be a vehicle of a revelation from the mind of the universe. And I think as a Christian, I find in the person of Jesus a revelation of the nature and purpose of God, which is namely that there's something of ultimate, absolute value about human personal flourishing and human life. And this is a categorical obligation that you must revere every human life and your own. And personhood, in the sense of the flourishing of conscious abilities and capacities, is a religious obligation, and it's a participation in the being of the God who is revealed in Jesus Christ, because if you say that as a Christian that God was incarnate in a human person, there are many different understandings of that, but one of them is simply that God was showing that the human person is sacred. It has that quality of categorical obligation. It's something you have to respect. It's a moral have to. So the path from idealism to religion, for me, was in fact, autobiographically, a path from atheism to Christianity. You don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be an idealist, but I'm just saying this is the way that one philosopher has gone, and I could give you 100 philosophers who have been idealists. They haven't all been Christian, but Christianity becomes a reasonable claim that the mind of the universe, the consciousness which gives rise to everything material, without which perhaps there wouldn't be anything material at all, I really do believe that, that mind has disclosed in a mysterious and ambiguous way, but it has disclosed in a way clear enough for us to commit our lives to it, that the purpose is the flourishing of human personal life. And that's why I'm a personal idealist, and I would just end by saying I think it's very reasonable to commit yourself to something which you found to be categorically obligatory, even though it is objectively uncertain, if it's of great importance to the continuance and flourishing of your life and your way of living in the universe. Thank you.